launch of Saif Mahmood's brilliant book, Beloved Delhi. We've made many more like you. Thank you everyone for joining us. And now for the moment that we've all been waiting for with bated breath. I would like to request Mr. Shah to come on stage and read from the book.
Good evening. दिल्ली के शायरों की बात हो और मिर्जा गालिब का जिक्र ना आए ये तो नामुमकिन है। और आप सबके चेहरों से ऐसा लग रहा है कि आप मुंतज़िर हैं कि मैं आपको गालिब के बहुत सारे अशआर सुनाऊंगा। मैं आपकी इन उम्मीदों पे पानी फेरना नहीं चाहता, लेकिन अगर गालिब का कलाम सुनना ही है तो आप YouTube पर जा सकते हैं बड़ी आसानी से। मुझसे कहीं बेहतर कहने वाले सैयद साहब की आवाज़ में, फरीदा खानम साहिबा की आवाज़ में, बहुत सारे लोगों की आवाज़ में आप सुन सकते हैं। मैं कुछ इस बेहतरीन किताब के कुछ हिस्से पढ़ के सुनाना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि कुछ ऐसी बहुत सारी बातें हैं। एक तो मैं ये सबसे पहले बता दूँ कि मैं उर्दू का आलिम बिल्कुल नहीं हूँ और उर्दू शायरी का भी नहीं। मुझे मिर्जा गालिब समझा जाता है, इसमें मेरा कोई कसूर नहीं। और गालिब का कलाम वैसे ही हर एक जानता है। उनके मशहूर नज़्मों या गज़लों को पढ़ने का मेरे ख्याल से कोई फ़ायदा नहीं। मैंने सोचा कि मैं आपको इस किताब के कुछ ऐसे हिस्से पढ़ के सुनाऊँ जो ऐसे शोरा के बारे में जिनका मैंने नाम भी नहीं सुना था, और उनके बारे में जो कुछ बातें हैं, तो मैं सिर्फ मिर्ज़ा मोहम्मद रफ़ी सौदा के मज़मून से और बहादुर शाह ज़फ़र के मज़मून से कुछ आप लोगों को पढ़ के सुनाना चाहता हूँ। गालिब साहब की एक नज़्म ज़रूर सुनाऊंगा जो यकीनन आपने कभी नहीं सुनी होगी, लेकिन उससे पहले सैफ साहब के इस बेहतरीन इंट्रोडक्शन पेश लफ्ज़ से मैं कुछ हिस्से पढ़ना चाहता हूँ, क्योंकि दिल्ली की तारीख़ और 17वीं 18वीं 19वीं सदी में जो अदबी हालात थे वो क्या थे, उनके बारे में है। तो ये इंट्रोडक्शन है इस किताब का, जिसके कुछ हिस्से मैं आपको बता सुनाऊंगा। Delhi's charms are unpredictable. The chaotic streets, the unruly traffic and polluted air, the aggressive inhabitants and their hurried life, tolerance for the obnoxious. All these constitute an integral part of this phenomenal city. In beauty resides horror and vice versa. Inextricably intertwined with Delhi's complicated present is her violent history, a history of invasions and assaults, even massacres. It has been lamented many times through the centuries, yet it lives. Each time it was razed to the ground, it came back to life with startling vivacity. Nothing dies in Delhi. The ghosts of its past lives roam the streets or bide their time in half-ruined buildings, and they rise up to speak in 1,000 voices that are still told about the city. Struggling to breathe under the angry modern facade of the megalopolis is another one, time-worn and easily missed, that teems with art, heritage and poetry. It is the Delhi of Mir and Ghalib, the Delhi of the fabled 7 cities, all of which have risen and fallen and risen again, or been changed beyond recognition over time. Delhi's indestructible spirit has haunted writers and poets for generations. Some of them have written out of love, others in awe, and yet others out of bewilderment. In the 18th century, Mir Taqi Mir said, "Dil o dilli dono agar hain kharab, par kuch lutf is ujle ghar mein bhi hai." In the middle of the 20th century, Percival Spear compared Delhi with Rome. There are many etymologies that have been offered for the name Delhi, but perhaps one of the most appealing is the philosopher Ramchandra Gandhi's suggestion that its name could derive from the words Dehli or Dehli, both meaning threshold, a permanent point of entry and departure, but forever resistant to any stamp of permanence. The city Delhi most resembles is Athens, with its monumental crumbling history strewn all around, its ramshackle, seething present. In this seething present, Delhi is bigger, more sprawling than it has ever been. Officially called the National Capital Territory of Delhi, it is the third largest city of India in terms of size, covering an area of approximately 1,500 square kilometers and the second largest in terms of population, home to more than 25 million people. And in the heart of this megacity, in the northeast of its central district, lies Purani Delhi, Old Delhi, where the tale of its glory in ruin and haphazard regeneration is best perceived. It is this walled city of narrow, crowded and cacophonous alleys where it is impossible to walk a few paces or even stand still without touching literally at least 10 other people that this book is about. Or rather about a few great men of verse who internalized the spirit of this remarkable patch of earth so deeply that they were Delhi and Delhi was them. And together, Purani Delhi and its iconic poets tell a 300-year-old story. The story of one of the most evocative languages ever known to humankind, Urdu. It is generally believed that Urdu was born in the army camps of Delhi as a language that borrowed words from different languages so that soldiers from different parts could easily communicate with each other. Those who subscribe to this belief think that since in Turkish the word Urdu refers to an army camp and the language was a product of interaction between soldiers in army camps, it was called Urdu. Noted author and critic Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, however, dismisses this claim. What he writes is, Farooqi Sahab writes, the belief that Urdu originated in Muslim army camps and cantonment bazaars helped generate and sustain two myths. Urdu was the language of the Muslims, and being originally the language of camp and cantonment, it stood in natural need of being refined and gentrified. And the process was initiated by the master poets of Delhi in the second half of the 18th century. Small wonder then that the name Urdu, which didn't come into use for the language before the 1780s, is invariably invoked by our historians to prove that since Urdu means army, army camp, or the market of a camp, the Urdu language was born as a result of foreign Muslims and local Hindus interacting with each other for petty trade and commerce. None struggled to consider that the only foreign armies in India during and from the 1780s were British and some French. There were no Arabic or Persian or Turkish-speaking armies in India from the 1780s, and the language of Urdu had by then been in existence for several centuries. Thus, the name Urdu, which first came into use apparently in the 1780s, could not have been given to the language because of the putative army connection. A ghazal is a collection of many couplets, sher, of the same length and following the same meter. These couplets are thematically autonomous of each other. Sometimes, though, a few of them can be read together, indicating a single theme, and when this is done, the cluster of couplets is called qita or qata. Each line of a sher is called a misra, and the first sher of a ghazal is called the matla. In the matla, the two lines rhyme with each other, whereas throughout the rest of the ghazal, only the second lines of the sher rhyme with each other. However, after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, the empire had started fragmenting. By the time Zafar inherited the throne in 1837, he was already 62 and frail. Delhi had changed. The territorial limits of the empire barely extended beyond the walls of the Qila Mohalla, the Red Fort, and the grandeur of the Mughal crown had almost faded away, forcing Zafar to compare it with a beggar's bowl. Ya mujhe afsare shahana banaya hota, ya mera taj gadayana banaya hota. Roz mamure duniya mein kharabi hai Zafar, aisi basti se to veerana banaya hota. Zafar's idea of piety and his attitude to religion were closer to those of the ordinary people of his land than of austere theologians and clergy. According to some of his biographers, he was predisposed to common earthly beliefs. For instance, that peers and saints possess supernatural powers. He had his own inner circle of astrologers, soothsayers, and clairvoyants. As protection against the evil eye, he would himself use and also distribute to his disciples all kinds of charms, and would regularly sacrifice animals, donate cows to the poor, bury eggs, and order arrests of black magicians. Read urban Naxals. He was not only convinced of the existence of jinns, but also believed that they were amongst his loyal subjects. When the British began the massacre of Delhi to crush the 1857 mutiny, Zafar was initially unperturbed because his spiritual advisors had persuaded him to believe that no harm could come to an emperor who was protected by jinns. Zafar was well aware that the Mughal throne he had inherited was a sham and the empire mere fiction. Even to travel up to the dargahs at Nizamuddin or Mehrauli from his qila, he had to seek permission of the British resident. As his 2-decade-long symbolic rule progressed and years passed by, he became more and more distraught by a situation that he could do nothing about. Even age was not on his side. He felt worthless and helpless. The Qila-e-Mualla, despite the collapse of the Mughal Empire and the strange circumstances of the emperor, frequently played host to a large number of poets, writers, and artists. These included Hakim Sanaullah Khan Firaq, not to be confused with the famous Firaq Gorakhpuri, who was born decades later, Mir Ghalib Ali Sayyid, not to be confused with Mirza Ghalib, Hafiz Abdul Rahman Khan Ehsan, Burhanuddin Khan Isat, Hakim Qudratullah Qasim, his son Mir Izzatullah Ishq, Mia Shakeba, a disciple of Mir Taqi Mir, Mirza Azim Beg, and Mir Qamaruddin Minnat, and his son Mir Nizamuddin Mamnoon. For an Urdu poet, the greatest honor would be an invitation to recite at the royal mushaira in the qila. Like most poets, Zauq too, that was the poet laureate, Mirza Ibrahim Zauq, Hazrat Ibrahim Zauq, too had an ardent desire to be associated with the qila. His friend Beqarar worked for the royal family and was engaged in the personal staff of Bahadur Shah Zafar, who, the then Wali Ahad, heir apparent, or crown prince, on the advice of a few well-wishers, Zauq persuaded Beqarar to introduce him to the Wali Ahad, then 22 years old. Zauq became a regular visitor in the qila, and the Wali Ahad soon became extremely fond of his poetry. Zafar, however, no, that's a little later. Excuse me, there was a section about Ghalib. You see, Bahadur Shah Zafar and Ghalib and Zauq were contemporaries. So there's a very interesting piece on the relationship between Ghalib and Zafar. That's right here. Got it. No, wrong again. Anyway, I think when I find it, we'll read it later. Zafar, however, was not taken seriously as a poet by his contemporaries. In his list of the 17 greatest Urdu poets of the 19th century Delhi, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan does not name Zafar. It is believed that even Ghalib, who took over as Zafar's ustad rather late in life, did not consider him a particularly good poet. But Zafar took his poet quite seriously. Soon after becoming emperor, he had appointed as his ustad Sheikh Muhammad Ibrahim Zauq, whose literary rivalry with Ghalib successfully kept the latter out of the Mughal court for long years. Many critics who regard Zafar as a run-of-the-mill poet have alleged that some of his best couplets ascribed to him were actually penned, or at least partly penned, by Zauq, an accusation that seems speculative, if not completely unfounded. The royalty has always loved being eulogized, and Zafar was no different. In 1830, presumably on the recommendation of some of his advisors, he commissioned Mirza Ghalib to write an account of the history of the Mughal Empire in Persian poetry and conferred upon him the titles of Dabir-ul Mulk and Najmul Dawla. A biannual honorarium was fixed for him. Ghalib, who was continuously in debt, would rather have had a monthly remuneration. One day, while in attendance at the royal court, Ghalib, who was aware of the emperor's soft corner for adulatory poets, beseeched him in a longish poem to convert his biannual honorarium into a monthly one, holding that the practice of paying someone just twice a year was a slur on Mughal generosity. And this was the darkhast that Ghalib said. "Ay Shahenshah Asma aur Rang, ay Jahandar Aftab Asar." He's really buttoning him up, right? "Bar नौकर भी हो गया सद शुक्र निस्बतें हो गई मुशख्खस जार न कहूँ आपसे तो किससे कहूँ मुद्दे जरूरी अल-इज़हार कुछ खरीदा नहीं है अब के साल कुछ बनाया नहीं अब की बार रात को आग और दिन को धूप भाड़ में जाएं ऐसे लैल व नहार मेरी तनख्वाह जो मुकर्रर है उसके मिलने का है अजब हंजार रस्म है मुर्दे की छमाही एक और छमाही हो साल में 2 बार मुझको देखो हूँ बक़ैद हयात बस की लेता हूँ हर महीने कर्ज और रहती है सूद की तकरार आपका बंदा और फिरूं नंगा आपका नौकर और खाऊं उधार मेरी तनख्वाह कीजिए माह बमाह ता न हो मुझको जिंदगी दुश्वार तुम सलामत रहो 1000 बरस हर बरस के दिन हो 50,000। Zafar had been emperor for 20 years when the revolt of 1857, the first war of independence as we like to call it, broke out. He was almost 82, infirm and ailing, but the revolt jolted him out of his melancholic stupor. He himself hadn't proactively done anything to initiate the uprising, but the Indian sepoys of the East India Company who had risen in revolt found in the Mughal emperor a figure under whom all of them could unite across national, religious and communal and territorial lines. On the 11th of May 1857, sepoy regiments from Meerut, which had been among the first to revolt, reached Delhi and sought audience with their emperor. It appears that Zafar, feeling guilty about his inaction and lack of resolve in the face of British atrocities, decided to meet them the next day and, sunk in emotion, promised them his full support. He immediately issued a Shahi Farman, a royal decree calling upon all his subjects to join the revolt, clearly stating that he had decided to stand by his people. But the revolt failed and terrible retribution followed. British forces began to slaughter captured sepoys and also the civilian population in towns across northern India. In places like Kanpur, the sepoys themselves had killed unarmed British families, and the British used this to legitimize their brutality. By the time the company forces reached Delhi, terror and tyranny had become their official policy. During the 4-month siege of Delhi by the British forces, there was a wholesale massacre in Delhi in order to force Zafar and the rebel sepoys who now owed allegiance to him to surrender. Zafar was charged and tried on 4 counts, 2 of aiding rebels, 1 of treason, and 1 of being party to the murder of 49 British residents of Delhi who had taken shelter in the Qila, fearing massacre at the hands of the rebel sepoys. The emperor was spared, but not his sons. Hodson, while bringing back Zafar's 3 sons, Prince Mirza Mughal, Mirza Khazr Sultan, and Mirza Abu Bakr, killed them near the Khuni Darwaza, opposite what is today the Maulana Azad Medical College. It is widely believed that their headless bodies were then hung in front of the Kotwali, the present-day Fountain Chowk opposite Gurudwara Seesganj Sahib in Chandni Chowk. The same place from where more than 100 years ago, on 22nd March 1739, Nadir Shah had begun his ruthless onslaught on the people of Delhi. The aged and ailing emperor could hardly understand that he was facing a trial. He read out a short written defense in Urdu and denied any connection with the mutiny, contending that he had been a helpless prisoner of the rebel sepoys. He did not cross-examine any witness. The prosecutor maintained that Zafar had engineered the revolt as part of a larger organized Islamic conspiracy. On the 9th of March 1858 at 11 a.m., Harriet closed his final submission, the prosecution lawyer. After 4 hours at 3 p.m. on the same day, all members of the court-martial unanimously declared Zafar guilty on all and every part of the charges preferred against him and sentenced him to be transported for the remainder of his days either to the Andaman Islands or to such other place as may be selected by the Governor General in Council. On the 7th of October 1858, Zafar left Delhi for Rangoon on a bullock cart, accompanied by his wives, his 2 surviving sons and some servants. The family was then incarcerated in a quarter near the Shwe Dagon Pagoda. Records say that the family was provided 4 rooms of 16 square feet each and 4 Indian attendants, a peon, a water carrier, a washerman and a sweeper. Zafar was denied pen and ink and paper, but the poet in him was not yet dead. It is believed that the forlorn emperor used a burnt stick to inscribe his last verses on a wall of his room. Lagta nahi hai ji mera ujle dayar mein, kiski bani hai aalame napaidar mein, keh do in hasraton se kahin aur ja bas ke, itni jagah kahan hai dile dar. कितना है बदनसीब ज़फ़र, दफन के लिए 2 गज ज़मीन भी न मिली कोई यार में।
So we are not yet half as good in the art of Qasida Padna, but we make do with the best that we can do, which is some flowers. And now, let's have on the dais the man who wrote this superlative book, Saif Mahmood. Saif is a Supreme Court advocate by profession and a poet at heart. And now we have Kausar Munir, who's a film writer and a lyricist. What follows now is a conversation about the book, how it came about, and Urdu at large. So Kausar and Saif, both of you, given your felicity with words, I'm sure this is going to be a riveting discussion. So I leave it to you guys. And I think beech mein Anand Rana, who has shot the photographs for the book, some beautiful photographs, will join in the discussion. So let's start with the conversation.
से कि मुझे कभी पढ़ाया लिखाया नहीं गया उर्दू, तो ये एक दिस इज अ मिसकंसेप्शन, क्योंकि मेरा नाम कौसर मुनीर है और मैं जी बिल्कुल, और ये मैं हिंदुस्तानी फिल्मों में गीत लिखती हूँ या कुछ डायलॉग लिख लेती हूँ, तो मेरी जो जानकारी है उर्दू और मैं बल्कि हिंदुस्तानी कहना ज़्यादा पसंद करूँगी, कुछ बहुत ही आले दर्जे की होगी, लेकिन बिल्कुल भी नहीं। I am an absolute mongrel who, often even thought that certain Marathi words were actually Hindi, because we grew up thinking that, कि दादर शायद, so I used to think दादर is an Urdu/Hindi word which means steps, but actually it's a Marathi word. So it is, this is a kind of an education for me, this book, to kind of understand the origins of Urdu as a language, and in a language that I perhaps have been trained to understand and to speak and read and write in, which is English. So thank you. So not just to be here talking to you, but as a reader. शुरू में करना चाहूँगी इस टाइटल से, beloved Delhi, a Mughal city, and her greatest poets. I totally approve. लेकिन but tell us about her.
Yeah. Yes, I'll tell you two things about this. एक तो साहब वो फैज का एक बहुत छोटा सा बंद है कि वो लोग बहुत खुशकिस्मत थे जो इश्क को काम समझते या काम से आशिकी करते। हम जीते जी मसरूफ रहे, कुछ इश्क किया, कुछ काम काम इश्क के आड़े आता रहा, अभी तालियां मुंह में ठहर काम इश्क के आड़े आता रहा और इश्क से काम उलझता रहा, फिर तंग आता रहा, फिर हमने दोनों को अधूरा मेरा मामला ये है, जैसे आप फरमा रही हैं कि भाई मैं I was born in Bombay and I thought that many of Marathi words, Hindi words, etc. With me, it was just the other way around. I was born and brought up literally in the lap of Urdu. In my family, we used to have different diwane ghalib in every room, and a diwane kulliyat iqbal in every room, and the conversations were not only about poetry but also in poetry. I'll give you an example. हमारे पास एक खरगोश था, अपने घर में पाला हुआ था, तो वो हम लोग रात को जो है डाइनिंग टेबल पर बैठे थे, खाना खा रहे थे, उस स्कूल एंड वो खरगोश साहब हैं, वो किचन के दरवाजे से झांक के देखते थे, उनको बुलाइए तो अंदर वापस चले जाते थे। तो हमारी अम्मा ने दाग और मशहूर शेर पढ़ा कि खूब पड़ता है कि चिलमन से लगे बैठे हैं, साफ छुपते भी नहीं, सामने आते थे। इसी तरह ही गुफ्तगू होती थी हमेशा से। एंड दिल्ली इज व्हाट वाज न्यू, दिल्ली हैज ऑलवेज एन्चैंटेड मी। इट डिडंट when I was growing up in Delhi, even though the Delhi of my school days and college days was a far more, it was a more beautiful place and calmer and more peaceful, etc. तो मैं एक ब्लॉग लिखा करता था और उसका टाइटल था दिल्ली जो एक शहर मीर के अल्फाज से किया गया, and from that blog extracts used to be published in First City उर्दू के शोरा पे 3-4, जैसे गालिब को आपने भी फरमाया कि नजमुद्दौला और किताब सब दिए गए और उनसे कहा गया कि भाई आप ये लिखिए हिस्ट्री ऑफ द मुगल एम्पायर इन पर्शियन। ऐसे कुछ मेरे साथ भी हुआ था, लाइक गालिब वेंट टू मीट हुमायूं एंड देन स्टॉप बिकॉज़ ही वाज वेरी लेट बैक शायर, सो वाज आई आल्सो स्टॉप्ड आफ्टर 3 years। लेकिन फिर मुझे ये सूझा कि साहब ये काम जो है इसको करना चाहिए। तो दिल्ली जो है वो वैसे तो ट्रेडिशनली आप देखिए अगर आपके एक जुबानों में cities have been referred to in the feminine gender, but more so for Delhi because Delhi was the female beloved of her poets. So in the title, I have bowed down to this archaic, traditional use, romantic use, but in the entire book, I have used the safer it, beloved Delhi, and it's
you chickened out. So are these your chosen 8 lovers of?
जी, so it's beloved Delhi, a Mughal city in English. So who are we talking about? We are talking about the poets of Delhi when it used to be a Mughal city. Shah Jahanabad, 1700 के आसपास जो है वली मोहम्मद वली दक्कनी, who's widely believed to be the father of Urdu ghazal, travels to Delhi, and there is when Urdu poetry starts in the city of Shah Jahanabad. I have covered this period from early 1700s to 1905, when Daf Tehri, the last poet of the Delhi school, Mirza Muhammad Rafi Sauda, who was a great satirist, Khwaja Mir Dard, who was actually a Sufi saint, but a brilliant romantic poet, Mir Taqi Mir, who was called the Khudai Subhan, the god of poetry, Mirza Azadullah Khan Ghalib, जो हमारे सामने आता है, खुलता किसी पे क्यों मेरे दिल का मामला शेरों के इंतखाब में रुस्वा किया, तो मुझे शेरों के भी इंतखाब में रुस्वा किया और शायरों के भी इंतखाब में रुस्वा किया।
बैठे रहे आगे मत जा,
आगे चलते हैं।
Mr. Radhaka, I'd like you to come as well. Piyush Shah and Anand. Please come and unveil the book, a book that I think we all want to read and of course go on these lovely walks.
आगे ना आगे मत सचिन।
उनका तो है, रुक एक मिनट, जस्ट वेट। टीम में आ रहे हैं
मतलब
पार्टी है ना
ये भाई
भाई पैर कट रहा है तेरे सर पे
सर इधर सर इधर नासिर सर इधर एक्सक्यूज मी
यो ऑल ऑफ यू स्ट्रेट
लोग स्ट्रेट
सर स्ट्रेट सर नसीर सर
नासिर सर
नसीर सर थैंक यू सर स्ट्रेट सर जस्ट बोलो सर
बढ़िया थोड़ा बाहर बोला ना थोड़ा
सर कैन यू slightly come ahead because the light is just falling upon me yeah yes yeah you can
यस
yes sir
नासिर सर
sir straight sir thank you let us join for dinner
A big pat on the back to the talkative team for their canvas spirit. Hema and team